Hello, thank you for joining this week's Washington Talk. I'm Ji Ha-ham. The U.S. government revealed that Russia has purchased weapons from North Korea for the ongoing war in Ukraine. The State Department said it would be a clear violation of the UN sanctions on North Korea. Meanwhile, South Korea is expressing concerns over the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, as it could affect South Korean economy negatively. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
The Security Council imposed this prohibition over a decade ago in response to the DPRK's weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile program.
In the studio with me is Robert Rapson. Mr. Rapson served as Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission at U.S. Embassy Seoul and as Director for Korean Affairs at the State Department. He also served as Deputy Economic Counselor at Embassy Seoul. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is a Director of U.S. Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume reviews the first decade of North Korean foreign policy under Kim Jong-un. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Both.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay. The U.S. government said the Russian Ministry of Defense is in the process of purchasing millions of rockets and artillery shells from North Korea for use on the battlefield in Ukraine. The U.S. State Department stressed that multiple UN Security Council resolutions prohibit UN members from procuring North Korean weapons. Mr. Rapson, the Biden administration has been publicly announcing about the adversary's plans. Is this a new strategy that they, how to stop the adversaries, what they are about to do?
Well, thank you, Gia. And again, it's great to be here on your program. If I could right up front, just wish a very happy Chuseok to all your viewers, and of course the VOA team here. You do a great job, so thank you for having me on today. Whether the revelation earlier this week by the Pentagon that purported intelligence that Russia is looking to purchase munitions, artillery or the like from North Korea, whether that's a new overall strategy for the U.S., this effort to be transparent on the intelligence side, I don't think it's a new strategy per se, but it's certainly the approach we've adopted with respect to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. As you well recall, months before the invasion took place, we were forecasting and revealing intelligence that indicated what Russian intentions were. So in watching the press conference earlier this week at the Pentagon, the context for that briefing was the situation on the battlefield and Russia's situation with respect to its invasion. So I think it's part and parcel of that approach. Of course, there are consequences with respect to North Korea, which have to do with sanctions violations and what Russia will or won't do with respect to any arms it may purchase from North Korea.
Mr. Snyder, we know what Russia would get, but we don't know what North Korea would get in return. So what do you think it would be? I mean, can it be cash or the form of food assistance?
First, I think that's a very long transcontinental supply chain that we're talking about if Russians are sourcing weapons from North Korea. And we've seen the reports that Russia might be sending wheat to North Korea. Certainly, I think that there may be some cash compensation. But the real benefit for this, I think, is in terms of political solidarity between the two countries. And so I think that's actually the biggest payoff for the North Koreans.
Okay, Mr. Rapson, can nuclear or missile technologies be the payment for this weapon?
I tend to think not. Obviously, it's hard to predict what the thought processes are in the Kremlin and certainly in Pyongyang. But I think Russia, historically, even up till recently, has been a very strong advocate on the nuclear front, on non-proliferation, as well as missile technologies. And there are many other, let's say, payment forms that the Russians can use to compensate North Korea for any weaponry it may purchase. Scott mentioned the reports of wheat, and that's one area, but there are many other areas where North Korea is in demand or in need of, and certainly the Kremlin could utilize those products and those channels to supply that, if indeed there is arms sales going on. But I'm not concerned or worried at this point that the Russians may decide to quid pro quo provide North Korea with nuclear technologies or missile technologies. But we have to watch that space.
Mr. Snyder, are Russia and North Korea strengthening their ties, in the wake of the war in Ukraine? Are their relations heading in a new direction?
I think that we have seen public statements from both leaders in an exchange of letters that suggest that we are on a track for improvement of the relationship. Putin, I think, sent a letter to Kim Jong-un talking about a cooperative and constructive relationship, and Kim Jong-un reciprocated by saying that the relationship could involve strategic and tactical cooperation. And if you really step back and think about it, in some ways what North Korea appears to be doing with Russia looks a lot like actually what Park Chung-hee did during the war in Vietnam with the Johnson administration. And that is responding to a political need of a major patron and ally. And by doing that, Kim Jong-un can actually get a lot of benefits. And I think that we can see that Kim Jong-un is doing this through the way that North Korea has supported Russia at the UN related to the resolution condemning the invasion of Ukraine, and also the way in which the North Korean authorities have expressed support for the breakaway republics within the territory of Ukraine where the Russians have tried to set up governments.
Mr. Rapson, do you have anything to add?
No, I think, I agree with Scott on the assessment there. And, historically they've had ties, they've ebbed and flowed, waxed and waned over the years, and now it's building back up because both sides have an interest in what the other perhaps can offer it. And at the bottom line, of course, is in the Security Council with respect to North Korea. It just further insulates North Korea from any further UN actions on the sanction front, given the proximity, the closeness now of these ties with Russia.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, as we know, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, but it's becoming a sanctions evader now, a major one. Mr. Rapson, can we still rely on the Security Council?
Well, of course we have to rely on the Security Council. It's the eminent structure in place, international structure, through which these issues and similar issues have been handled, will continue to be handled. But the matter is the way the UN Security Council is structured or constituted, that the permanent members have veto power, and two of the permanent members, Russia and China now, are not supportive of additional sanctions against North Korea, and we've seen that recently. The big test, or a test coming forward, will be if North Korea proceeds with its 7th nuclear test, and that will raise the ante, but it will certainly reveal where both Moscow and Beijing stand on this issue with respect to North Korea.
Right. Mr. Snyder, there has been skepticism among Korean watchers about the role of the Security Council, whether it can handle the North Korean problems or not. Will this Russia-North Korea issue reinforce their skepticism?
Yes, I am among those who are quite pessimistic about what the Security Council can do under these circumstances. It's very much like in the Cold War when we had veto-wielding permanent members who had opposing points of view, and nothing really happened. But I think that the broader challenge is related to, as you mentioned, Russia is being sanctioned, North Korea has been sanctioned, and this creates a new domain of the sanctioned. And for North Korea, this really expands its options, actually. And it generates more opportunities to undermine the Security Council's existing sanctions. And so this is really a boon, I think, for the North Koreans.
Let's change the topic. North Korea this week announced that it is codifying its nuclear status. What do you need to know about this?
Well, in some respects, there was nothing new about what Kim Jong-un was stating. We know that North Korea is wedded to its nuclear capability. But the legislation that they tried to use to codify this status really also, I think, serves as one of the most clear expressions of North Korea's nuclear doctrine that we have seen. It indicates very clearly that command and control should lay in the hands of Kim Jong-un himself. It talks about how North Korea is almost using nuclear weapons as a kind of poison pill to make sure that if there's any external threat to the regime, that nuclear use would be viewed as almost an automatic response. And so we should take note of that. And they also talked about how they would want to be a responsible nuclear state. Hard to know exactly what that might actually mean in practice.
Okay. Mr. Rapson, how did you see the announcement?
Yeah, again, I agree with Scott. There's nothing terribly new there. The operative phrase, it codifies what we believe was or has been a nuclear doctrine for North Korea, so it's out there in the open, transparent. I think the additional factor here to focus on is, of course, the commentary afterwards from North Korea that if there is any indication of a preemptive strike being conducted against it, then it reserves the right then to preempt with its own response. And that cuts very close to the South Korean government, Yoon Suk-yeol administration's heavy emphasis on the kill chain and the potential, the possibility for preemptive strikes if indeed they're warranted.
Okay, the top nuclear negotiators of the U.S., South Korea, and Japan had a meeting this week in Tokyo. The officials confirmed that they would respond firmly if Pyongyang carries out a nuclear test. What kind of response can we think of?
Well, it's a good question, and the fact that the special envoys have been meeting is a good thing. They've been meeting regularly, and at every opportunity where they can meet and coordinate on policies and any developments that have occurred prior to the last meeting, it's a good thing. We need to see more of that. The optic is part of the deterrence effect. But I think what is meant by we will respond quickly, forcibly in some of the iterations is that we'll see more of the deterrent element out there. The U.S. has the capability to surge strategic assets to the region. We've just conducted a very extensive military exercise with the RRK, the first of its kind in 5 years. So a continuation of that, but proportionate to the threat or the provocations that we see from North Korea.
Right. Mr. Snyder, as always, the U.S. stressed the importance of trilateral cooperation, but can South Korea and Japan overcome some of their remaining issues at this moment?
Well, we'll see if those issues are going to be overcome, but I think that what is clear is that trilateralism has been one of the most preferred tools by which to try to get around some of the issues that exist between Japan and South Korea. And I think that the meeting among national security advisors was good evidence of the progress that is being made on that front.
Right. Vice President of the United States Kamala Harris will travel to Japan and South Korea. The White House said the Vice President will highlight the strength of the alliances and the shared economic interests in the region. But there are concerns over the Inflation Reduction Act in South Korea as it is expected to impact the South Korean electric vehicle industry. Mr. Snyder, this new law will make South Korean electric vehicles to be excluded from the tax incentives. But as we know, the U.S. Has repeatedly emphasized the importance of the U.S. ROK economic alliance. So some South Koreans say the U.S. blindsided them. How should the U.S. respond?
Well, the Biden administration has a kind of coordination problem on its hands, and it's really related to a contradiction between the administration's stated strategy of building technology alliances with like-minded allies and the legislation that was passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was targeting, I think, Chinese components, but ended up hitting South Korean components as collateral damage in that process. And so it just means the administration has to work very hard in order to try to eliminate that contradiction in its approach, and it's going to require intensive consultations with both the South Korean government and with Congress in order to do so.
Mr. Rapson, the U.S. and South Korea agreed to launch a high-level consultation channel to discuss this IRA issue. But wouldn't there be a dilemma on the U.S. side because of the skyrocketing inflation and the upcoming midterm elections? Is that also important for the administration?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that Hyundai and Kia fell into this gap between the legislation as formulated, but it behooves both sides, Korea and the United States, to put their heads together behind closed doors and to find a possible way forward. The implementing details of the IRA have yet to be ironed out. So there's possibly a way forward there to find some room for Hyundai to bridge the next couple of years before it opens its plant in Georgia, I believe, in 2024. But this is part and parcel in many respects how alliances work. We have a great alliance. There's new momentum has been generated over the past 3 or 4 months. The president's visit, I think, pushed the alliance in a great direction, and the Yoon Suk-yeol administration is very supportive and running with it as well. But this is one of those issues, it's a tough one, but it, again, behooves both sides to work carefully, consult closely to see if a solution can be found. Whether or not Korea feels it has to avail itself of its rights under the FTA or even WTO, that's for down the road. But so far, Korea is doing all the right things and sending high-level delegations to the U.S. to express its concern and look for that way forward.
Yeah, I'm sure you also had to handle the similar situations when you were in the State Department or when you were in Seoul. What kind of coordination or discussion can we expect to see publicly or even privately?
Well, it's already out in the public. It's hard to put that back in the bottle. The Korean press has grabbed this issue and it, turned it in some respects into a defining issue of the relationship and the alliance going forward for the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. It's almost a litmus test. But that said, trade issues inherently are sensitive. The ones I've worked on over the years have had political background and backdrop to them. But at the end of the day, again, the alliance, the structures in place, and the intention on both sides to work together as allies and partners lies out there. So let's see what comes of the next several weeks and months as Korea pushes to make its case and the U.S. better understands the dimensions of the case and what solutions might be possible.
Can you maybe share some of your prior experience, when you deal with this kind of situation?
When I was deputy economic counselor at the embassy Seoul back in 1997, 8, 99, and the senior trade officer, we handled issues like screen quotas, we handled issues like soju tax that were at the time very relevant, and automobiles very relevant to both countries and needing solutions. We, of course, 10 years later, 15 years later, moved to the FTA. And under that rubric, I've been tracking and following, working on issues on the trade front. And the FTA, over the last 10 years, has served us very well. As we can tell by the numbers, trade investment has blossomed between the two countries in a way that we couldn't even forecast back in those early days. So yes, we have a strong relationship. We have a strong framework for managing trade. And now this is one of those cases where we have to, test the strength of the alliance and find solutions going forward.
If I could just add 2 points on this. I think that the Inflation Reduction Act hits differently depending on which companies you're talking about. It has a differential impact. And so, for instance, LG Energy Solutions is working with Ford and Tesla, and they will not be affected. Samsung, likewise, doesn't have a big impact on it from this legislation. And so, in some respects, this is really a Hyundai problem. But Hyundai has tremendous leverage in the form of $10 billion of investment commitments to the United States. And so I think that there is sufficient motivation for the Biden administration to try to work things out so that that investment is not put at risk.
The only thing I briefly add to that is this issue does not appear in a vacuum. There's some context to it, and of course, at the same time, this issue is percolating. The U.S. initiative on IPEF, the U.S. initiative on the CHIP Alliance is going forward too. So all of those factors weigh on both sides and other countries as they decide, their approach to going forward with the frameworks that the U.S. has proposed.
Mr. Snyder, there were media reports that South Korea will review whether to file complaint at the World Trade Organization, as Mr. Rapson mentioned earlier. Can this issue be a source of further conflict? How would it affect to the alliance?
It could be an issue of further conflict, but I'm actually pretty confident there is sufficient trust between the Yoon and Biden administrations to be able to address this without resorting to some kinds of legalistic measures. And so I'm hopeful that it'll be able to be worked out without going in that direction.
Yeah, this is not the beef crisis or issue from 2008 in my perspective on it. So that had different dimensions and proportions that really energized many in the Korean public. This less so.
Mr. Rapson, how should we take South Korea's frustration over this issue? I mean, some raise questions whether South Korea has been fully cooperative to many initiatives you just laid out. I mean, for example, Quad, Chip 4. Many say South Korea has been hesitant to join these U.S.-led groups. What do you think?
I don't think there's any connection between this issue surfacing as it has in any dissatisfaction or concern on the U.S. part about the strength of the Korean commitment to these other initiatives. Korea's been out front, on board early on. IPEF, Korea signed on even before the announcement was formally announced. The CHIP Alliance, Korea's committed to attending the opening meeting. Like any participant in these new initiatives, they need to find out what the initiative is about, what others are thinking, and then come to a position where they can productively engage the United States and move the initiative forward. So Korea's interests are at stake here. And remember, the Yoon administration has only been in office for 4 months now. And so it's a learning curve. I would call it, it's the administration's first encounter with real économique, as the economic security issues are real, important, so governments in Seoul as well as elsewhere in the region need to give serious attention to their own country's interest and how they're going to work with the U.S. and going forward.
You've worked with the previous administration in South Korea, the Moon government. Do you see a difference?
The dominant issue for most of the Moon government, at least the second half, was COVID. And so we were all under, we were reacting and dealing with an environment that was impacting us in so many ways. We didn't have as many salient trade issues, but this is now out there, and the Yoon team, very capable team, is dealing with it, and I think in an appropriate way. And the team they sent out, Ambassador or Minister An, the Trade Minister, he's very well thought of and a great negotiator. So again, it portends good, constructive conversations between the Korean government and the U.S. government.
Okay. Mr. Snyder, in Washington, there have been voices that South Korea should do more or should have done more, show its full support to these U.S. initiatives. Do you agree?
I do not detect a lack of enthusiasm on the part of the Yoon administration for participating in multilateralism led by the United States as an issue of concern. It might have been an issue of concern under the Moon administration, which preferred to frame such cooperation in bilateral alliance terms. Rather, I think the challenge going forward is actually the Biden administration's ability to channel that enthusiasm and to operationalize many of the ideas that it has been working on in order to push forward some of these initiatives.
Kim Jong-un in his speech said his country needs to counter hostilities from the U.S. He also noted that North Korea will never give up nuclear arms and has nothing to bargain with in any negotiations. However, the U.S. has been clear that it harbors no hostile intent toward North Korea, and the U.S. officials repeatedly expressed its willingness to engage with Pyongyang. Mr. Rapson, Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, and happy Chuseok to you and the team.
Happy Chuseok.
Yeah, happy Chuseok to you both.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.